Can you hear me fine with this mic?
Yeah, it sounds great.
Okay. I'm wearing this disguise because I don't want I got to keep my identity,
Yeah,
secret on my YouTube channel. So,
I I hear you, man. No worries.
yeah. Okay. So, if you want to introduce yourself to our my YouTube community and what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Curtis Childs, and I'm the Vice President of Programming at the Swedenborg Foundation. The Swedenborg Foundation is a not-for-profit that is dedicated to spreading awareness of the existence of Emanuel Swedenborg and his theological or spiritual experience, or whatever you want to categorize it as, set of works that he did in the second half of his life.
Okay. Um, so I guess we should just jump to the whole topic of this interview with Emanuel Swedenborg. Can you explain who he is and how he started his beliefs?
Yeah. So up until he was like 55, he was a celebrity scientist and inventor and government official in the mid 1700s in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
So he was like a Renaissance man. So he was well recognized in a ton of anatomical research. He brought like the first scientific journal to Sweden. He was an inventor, so he was inventing a lot of machines that were used in Sweden's mining industry, which was a major industry of a world power at the time. He was in the Swedish House of Nobles, which was part of their government. It's almost ridiculous the number of things he was involved in.
Mm-hmm.
Science wasn't quite as complicated then as it is now, so you really could be like out front of a number of fields at the time. And so he was newspapers would keep track of where he went, and he would get audiences with kings and queens. There were still monarchies in Europe at the time. So he was really making a name for himself. And then things started to get weird for him. He had a series of experiences that started out as dreams. And the reason that I know this is because he kept meticulous, detailed descriptions of everything that he went through. First in like a little journal that's been saved and published as the Journal of Dreams, but then in this longer extended, what we call this Journal of Spiritual Experiences, which was over a 30-year stretch when he was having these out of body or spiritually transformative experiences, or whatever you'd call them today. In addition to the stuff he actually published. So we have all this behind the scenes information too. So he was keeping what was originally like a travel journal, just saying, today I went from Amsterdam and arrived in London. And he started to record his dreams in it and start to try to analyze what they meant, which this was pretty early to be doing that. There wasn't psychology or psychoanalysis like there is now. But he was saying, I think this means this in my dreams. I think that there's this black dog that's appearing in my dreams. I think that that's a symbol of my pride and my ego and how it's getting the better of me. But then through the course of that, things started to break out of the dream world and he had stuff in like the hypnagogic state. So when he was just waking up or falling asleep, he would have these experiences. But then they moved into what he called a state of full wakefulness. So he started to have visual and auditory experiences of what he believes was another dimension of reality that he called the spiritual world. And that opened some kind of floodgate for him, and he became immersed in that world constantly. And so he was still, functioning in this world and able to have friends and go do still some government functions and things like that. But he was clearly, his view of reality had gotten changed. And he stopped doing his scientific publications and said, I'm just going to report on what I'm seeing on the other side. And initially he was doing that anonymously. But people found out eventually that it was him that was having these experiences. And so people got curious and they started to ask him things. Can you tell me what, my dead relative would have said? Can you tell me something only they would know? And so he got a little bit famous from that. But by and large, it was a terrible career move for him. He became, sort of a laughingstock of the scientific community because he started talking about how I can talk to spirits, which is not what you say to that company. But he was convinced that all of his scientific learning that he'd done was just giving him the foundation to truly understand this other dimension of reality that he was experiencing. So he dedicated the rest of his life to that, and left behind what I'm fairly certain is the most extensive record of inner experiences I think that anyone's done. I mean, he's got these, it's 30 volumes in total.
Wow.
And it's over the course of, as I said, 30 years. And a lot of people thought he was out of his mind because of what he was describing, but he was still very lucid. And he was able to write really coherently, able to do everything he needed to do to get those things published and distributed. So he hadn't lost his mind. So people didn't quite know what to make of it. And I love it. I love this stuff. I just like, I find so many insights into how life works and these amazing pictures he paints of why life is the way it is. So I'm hooked. Mm-hmm. And it's actually been extremely helpful for me in my life. And I've had to navigate. I've had some mental health stuff, like a lot of depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's like his description of the inner world, or the spiritual world, as he would say, has given me some really clear tools to help with that. I like the picture he paints overall of life. And so when something has helped you, you feel like, I want people to know that this is around. So the work that I'm doing is, a lot of people don't know about Swedenborg or aren't interested in it because it seems boring or technical or too religious or something when they come across it. But I think it's more interesting and more relevant than you might think. So I'm trying to make people aware. Not everyone's going to be into it, but I want to make sure that people don't pass it by without realizing, oh, there might be something that is valuable or interesting or helpful for me in here.
Okay. So since you said all that, how would you like persuade someone to get like into Swedenborg for their first, to get into it?
Yeah.
His beliefs.
First, I would have to figure out, where are they coming from? Because he's got such a broad swath of stuff. And I think one of the reasons why it's so hard for people to get into him is his material. Different parts of his material will really appeal to different segments and won't appeal to people who aren't interested in it. And I think this is part of why it's so hard for people to get into it, because some people classify him as a Christian mystic, because you'll get in there and he's talking about Christian sounding things. Like he'll talk about Jesus and talk about the Bible. He'll talk about angels and heaven. And for some people, they're like, yeah, that's great. I love that stuff. And other people are saying, okay, well, I know that that's a bunch of crap. Yes. So, but once you get in there, there's also this whole philosophical side to it, where he's talking about, here's the substance and the building blocks of the universe. There's essence, which he says that it's love and it's wisdom. So there's essence and form is the wisdom. And that stuff, and he would write particular books trying to appeal to the philosophical audience that he was targeting. And those books, I think a lot of religious people don't quite know what to do with. And then there's just all of the really bizarre, intense spiritual experience things he has, which a lot of people don't know what to do. So if it was somebody, I would say, like, if you're interested in experiences and like what's the inner world like, I would say go to his Journal of Spiritual Experiences. And that's like the raw material. It's not as polished, but it's really just, it's day-to-day entries. Like this is what happened to me at this time. This is how it felt. And this is what I think it meant. And I think it's just phenomenological. Like he's just describing that. So that's, at first I try to figure out what part of it might be interesting. And then what I would do is look at what of that is interesting to you. And then I could know, well, if you like what he says there, you're going to like what he says here and there and there and there.
So from these, the things that he wrote, if you could choose like one or a couple of your favorite spiritual experiences that has stuck with you.
Yeah. So Swedenborg talked a lot about the influence of spirits on the mind and on the body. So to him, the human body was a microcosm of all of existence. So it's not like the universe, if you zoomed out far enough, would look like a person, but all the functions that are in a person are the same functions that a system will play out at any level with. So you can look at, for example, and I've even seen, there's a lot of YouTube kind of documentaries where they'll zoom out on city streets and it looks like blood vessels because they're performing a similar function. So to him, everything in your body relates to any size group of individuals. So if you looked at just one society, like one town, you could see, okay, who in this town is playing the role of the head? Like who's leading this thing? Who's playing the role of the lungs, like bringing in ideas and distributing that? And so because of that, because that form shows up everywhere, when Swedenborg would interact with these entities that he would call spirits, they would always make sensations happen in parts of his body. So he would have, and he could tell something about what kind of people they were. What he said he believed was that the spirits are people who have died. Like you have a spirit in a body, and once your body goes away, then you just have a spirit, and then he calls you a spirit. And so each of us has a spirit in a body. And so just like your body is somewhere in the room, your spirit has to be in some location in the spiritual world. So your spirit can be approached by other spirits. And when they approach you, every person has some kind of relation to some part of the body because of the way that they think and feel. So certain spirits that were superficial would cause sensations in his skin. Certain spirits who were kind of narrow-minded would cause sensation in the parts of him that were less living, like bones or nails or something like that, something with less cellular activity in it. So there's a ton of experiences that deal with that, but I always thought that was a fascinating way to experience this kind of interaction. And he would also talk about communities of spirits affecting how he thinks. So if you look at the way the internet works now, we're everybody's talking about how your political and social silos really shape how you think, because when you get on your Facebook feed or wherever you are, it's all reinforced by messages from people who think in the ways that you think because you've clicked on their links and things, and it's tailored that to you. He said that you have a similar impact from the spiritual communities that you're associated with. And he talked one time about how he was reading some text and thinking about the concept there, and there was all these different societies of spirits. So just like, or societies is an old-fashioned sounding word that he used, but communities or cities of spirits. And each of them were having a perception of what he was reading, and they all had a different reaction and opinion to it. And all of their opinions converged on him. And then from that, they came together to kind of form the opinion he was having about it. But he was able to see which group of people contributed what and how they affected what he thought about it. So he's gaining this lucid access to where people's opinions and thoughts come from on the spiritual side. So I thought that was cool. Also, he had some experiences of transferable joy. He talked about a state that he talks about heaven and hell, but to him, heaven and hell are primarily states of mind. And it comes down to heaven is the joy of doing something constructive for somebody else. And hell is the joy of doing something destructive to someone else. Like both can be enjoyable. And that's the difference to him between heaven and hell. And so when he was in a heavenly state of mind and around spirits who were in that state, that's what he called angels, was people who are in this, in a mode of life where that's the thing that hypes them up the most, that they like the most, is to do good things for other people. He talked about thoughts, but also feelings being transferable. So he could, when he was experiencing joy, he could, like, I don't know how he did it, if he took his hands or something, but I'll just pantomime it like that. But he would be able to take the exact feeling that he was feeling and put it into the next person, and that they could do the same thing. So feelings could actually pass through whole groups of people, and the same thing with thoughts. And he talks about an amplification of joy. So in what he called heaven, which is where everybody's focused on, let's do constructive things for people to make their life better. the more joy any one person was feeling, the more they wanted to transfer that to the next person, because you could share feelings. So it was this positive feedback loop of more and more of that, what he would call like a heavenly space of joy. And we have a video called what Heaven Feels Like, which is a reading of his description of that with our best attempt at visuals around it. But it's a pretty cool picture of a way that you can have a really tight community around these feelings. So those are a couple of, I feel like I have a ton. There's so many of them, but those are a few.
I bet there is, yeah. So when your spirit does eventually, like when you eventually pass away, what's the process that happens when you die? Like with your spirit, how does it go up to heaven or down to hell? Like, what can you explain what goes on with that?
Yeah. So our YouTube channel is called Off the Left Eye. And that's a phrase that I took out of his description of, he says that he was shown what the dying process is like. It wasn't like, so have you heard of near-death experiences? Where now they'll write books about it. I saw the light, I was going to the tunnel. And it's usually when something has happened to them, like they were in a car accident and their body is in a lot of physical peril. But Swedenborg didn't have that, but he says that he was being shown what it's like to die, but his brain was his like rational mind was being kept intact so that he could remember it and write it down and everything. And he tells a story in two places, one in his book, Heaven and Hell, and one in the first volume of his book, Secrets of Heaven, but they're pretty similar. And he says it goes like this. So I was talking about how you have a spirit and a body. And he talked about his bodily functions slowly shutting down. He talked in particular about his breathing getting slower and slower until it was barely there at all. But he could then, because his physical stuff was quiet, he could start to feel what was going on in his spirit. He says the spirit is connected to every part of your body. So it's not just like the spirit is like a ghost looking thing that just is connected to your pineal gland or something. It's connected to every part of your body. So it has the same form as your body, but just more perfect or more complex. And he says that, so you have like spiritual lungs, just like you have physical lungs. So he could start to feel his spirit breathing, which was breathing more deeply than his body. And then it felt like, he says, I felt like he could feel a pull that was taking his spirit out of his body. So when he got out of it, he describes this progression of 3 stages. And it had to do, each stage was triggered by what was going on in him and then the approach of different kinds of spirits. So he says in the first stage, he didn't really have, his mind was pretty quiet and he wasn't, he didn't have any sensory input, like he wasn't seeing anything or hearing anything, but he could tell that he was surrounded by what he calls celestial angels. So these are people that have the most open minds. He says there's 3 levels of the human mind and you can open it up to different extents. And if it's the most open, you are in a state that he calls celestial angel. So very nice beings. And they were with him and like calming his emotions and making sure that no thoughts that were agitating or negative came into his mind. So he was there for just a little while. And then as he started to stir, he says those angels left and what he called spiritual angels took their place. And spiritual angels are more intellect focused. The first ones were like emotionally focused people. These ones are more thinking about concepts and ideas and things. And that he says, everything that happens in the spirit has like a visual representation with it. So concepts, the significance of events can be portrayed. It's sort of like, I think we can now do on screens with graphics and stuff, but it could just like a hologram sort of. So he said, it seemed like there was a covering being taken off of his left eye. And that's what gave him the use of spiritual sight. So that's where Off the Left Eye came from. And he says that's because the left has to do with our intellectual side and the right with our volitional side. And this is before, by the way, there was that right brain, left brain research. So I did see a paper where they were saying, yeah, he did a little bit preempt modern science on that. So then once he says, that's where he stops telling his personal story, but he says that for everybody, when you wake up in that second stage and you're with the spiritual angels, they'll do anything for you that you want. As I said, that they're motivated by the joy of doing helpful things for other people. To them, that's the most exciting thing, which is that's why they're in this state that's called heaven. And he says that you can stay with them for as long as you want. Only if you feel like you're getting smothered or are looking for something else do you say, all right, I need to go and find people who are more like me, because you may not be ready for that yet. So then you enter this place that he calls the world of spirits. Like the whole thing, heaven, hell, and everything he calls the spiritual world. But he says this initial sort of waiting room area that you go into, which is not a waiting room, it's a whole, it's a whole world. But he calls it the world of spirits. And that's where the point of it is to get what's in your character and then the persona that you put on, to get those to be in harmony. That in the world you never know exactly what somebody's really thinking or feeling, or if they're trying to get something out of you or what, but you need to get into this alignment where your motivation matches how you act, so that you can't have like hypocrisy there. And so this is basically people are making the choice to, okay, well, fundamentally, what's the pleasure what's the thing I enjoy most above all? Is it something constructive, or is it ultimately something destructive? And there's all kinds of processes that happen to get you to that point. And as you get yourself sorted out, then people don't put you in heaven or put you in hell, but what you do is start to gravitate towards people who are like you, and who particularly who love the same things that you love or enjoy the same things you enjoy. To him, he says that love or purpose or what you're striving for, what you're trying to do, that is kind of functions like gravity in a sense on the spiritual level. So you go and you gravitate towards people who are like you. So if you enjoy harming other people, you gravitate to people who like to do that. And so you form kind of a community with them. And if you gravitate towards people who are interested in enjoy helping people, then you gravitate towards them. And we've all got a bunch of both of those in us, but you have this time in the spiritual world or the world of spirits to sort that out. So that's the basics of what he says the transition is like.
Okay. So clearly the Bible affected the way he thought. How can you explain like how it changed his way of thinking with his beliefs?
Sure. Yeah. So he came out of a heavily Christian tradition. His father was a bishop in the Lutheran Church, which was the state religion in Sweden at the time. And Swedenborg is this interesting mix of Christian and then the opposite of Christian, because he talks about a lot of Christian stuff. He talks about heaven and hell, like I was saying. He talks about the Bible, but he usually has these takes on it that are different enough that the Christian church in his day put his works on trial. Like they actually went to court because they were heretical, because he'll talk about the Bible, but he believed that the entire Bible is like a metaphor, that it's actually written in a symbolic language, which is the same language that you dream in. So everything there is a story of meaning that's telling you about how human spiritual development happens. He doesn't think that it's actually like a literal textbook, or in a lot of places he says the stuff that's written in there never happened in real life. And he also says that you don't have to be Christian to go to heaven, the heaven that I was just talking about, which was not. Nowadays you probably find a lot of Christians that might say that. I don't know, but in his day that was a big deal. So but certainly the way that he approached everything was very Christian and biblically influenced. He'll talk about, you'll see a lot of Christian terminology in there. He'll talk about things like the Trinity. He also has his own definition that doesn't quite match up usually with Lutheran things. but he will use that terminology. He'll talk about things like the 10 Commandments, but to him, each of those 10 Commandments has a spiritual meaning to it. So, for example, the commandment against murder, don't murder anyone. That's not just about killing. It's about everything that's like, what's the essence of killing? So he says it's about things like hatred and trying to destroy somebody's reputation, anything that has that sort of, I'm going to hurt you in any way I can, that all that is part of the spiritual sense of that. It's interesting because there's a guy named D.T. Suzuki who was one, as far as I understand it, a major figure in bringing Zen Buddhism to the West. And he wrote this book called Buddha of the North about Swedenborg, because there's a lot of Christian language in Swedenborg's books, but his case was that thematically, and some of the bigger teachings about how life is and what it functions are actually very similar to a lot of Eastern traditions, including Buddhism. So the influence of the Christian tradition is all through Swedenborg's works. But he makes a lot of left turns that Christians in his time would definitely classify him as, you're not really Christian, you're something else. And people have been trying to figure out what box to put him in since then, because as I said, it's just a strange combination of flavors that he has in what he wrote.
Okay. It's already been 25 minutes, so we got one more question.
Sure.
I want this to go on for like 2 more hours, but
it went fast, man.
Yeah. Let's see here. Is there anything like any spiritual experiences that you've had that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I haven't really had any spiritual experiences.
No?
I think I've had dreams that felt like meaningful, or this is maybe more than a dream. I've had a couple of things that were right on the edge, but I'm pretty much like armchair spiritual experience enthusiast.
All right.
And what's that?
Yeah. I'll actually, I'll just pivot to there's another question here
Sure.
About dreams. Do you think that's like connected with the spirit world, having dreams, like any meanings to that? Like you're just about to go into that.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear about
that. So Swedenborg got very specific about where dreams come from and how they happen. And there were 3 major categories of dreams. He talks about dreams that come from angelic or good spirits, and that these are dreams that those spirits will put into your mind while you're sleeping. And they're usually the ones that feel really good and can actually tell you things that are going to happen. For what it's worth, I never had this, but my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, one time, this is just an anecdote, but she had this dream that her best friend bought a white Jetta. And the next day we were walking, and her friend called up and said, I bought a car. And it was a white Jetta. Which is like, okay, I don't know what to make of it. But he said that that can happen. There can be dreams that don't really have a point to them, which is just sort of like interference coming in from the spiritual world. And then there are nightmares, would be like demonic dreams that spirits who are trying to do bad, or have a malicious intent, are trying to harm you through those. He says that it's not quite like a one-to-one where that the spiritual world is doing something and you see that exactly in your dreams, but it falls into the things that are in your mind, like the concepts you have. So for example, he gave the example of that there were a couple of, he could wake up after his dreams and know what spirits caused his dreams and how it happened. So he said that while he was dreaming, and in his dream, there was somebody who was a superficial person that he knew, or that he assessed that person is pretty shallow and money focused. And when he woke up, these spirits told him that they had been talking about not that person, but the general state of mind of being superficial and shallow. And because they were talking about it near Swedenborg when he was asleep, it activated the things in his memory that went along with that. So this, according to him, would be why you think, why did I have that dream about that person from high school last night? Is because what we associate in our brains with what the input we're getting from the spiritual world ends up leading to dreams. So to him, yeah, they're definitely a portal to another world, but filtered often through our particular mind and experiences.
I've definitely had some dreams where I've connected with the real world, and same with like deja vu and stuff like that. That freaks me out a little bit, but it's
Yeah,
kind of cool when it happens though. But
right.
is there any closing statements you like where people can reach you, or your website, what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So we're at youtube.com/off the left eye. And we've got we have 1,000 videos. I'm not just saying 1,000, but we actually have 1,000
Yeah,
videos
I've
on
seen
there.
them.
Yeah. And there's everything. We've got a couple videos on dreams. We've got one that's called 8 Strange Places in the Afterlife. If you're just looking for what was some of that out there experiences that he had, there's just everything. And if you're looking for something in particular, just leave a comment on any of our videos, and we'll take a look, and we'll get you whatever links you need.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time. I know it was short. Maybe we can get another interview at some point again, because I have a lot more questions. But yeah, that was
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. This was fun.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. See ya.